Hello Internet, it's Drew, welcome back to the dungeon. In this video I want to discuss something that I refer to as a linchpin mechanic. An important condition that's usually not immediately obvious, but which is vital to the PC's success. It's going to be very difficult for them to win a combat encounter with a linchpin mechanic unless they discover this mechanic and exploit it. This type of mechanic has been present since forever in games. If you look at like even the old arcade games where you had maybe a boss that was invulnerable until you shot like a casing off it and revealed a weak point that you had to hit again and again, that kind of thing. A linchpin is something that the PCs discover and take advantage of in order to swing the balance of the encounter in their favor, whereas before it was oppressively against them. And ideally, again, because you want things to be dramatic, when this encounter is presented to the PCs, you want to make sure that it feels like that they can't win. Ratcheting up that kind of tension will enable a big payoff when the mechanic is discovered, and it feels very satisfying from the player's point of view and also as the DM to watch them run riot once they work out what they need to do. I find that this is also an extremely good way to integrate skill checks and even full skill challenges into a combat encounter, because often the linchpin will involve skill checks. You can run a skill challenge alongside or inside the combat encounter. So they're fighting enemies with all their combat powers and they're using skills on whatever it is that forms the linchpin. This makes the combat encounter very multifaceted and very fun and entertaining and hectic. From the PC's point of view, this is basically an exercise in discovering the valuable piece of information inside the scenario presented, right? So you give them a whole lot of information, a whole lot of like setting, the environment, the smells, the sounds, the enemies, the way they look, the way they're acting. Like there's all of this sort of scene setting that you're giving them. And somewhere in all of this sea of detail, there's going to be one little thing that they need to pay attention to that's very, very important and will let them win the day. So that's the satisfying thing on the PC's side. And often you'll see the table working together or players bouncing theories off each other to try to work out, oh, could it be this? Maybe it's that, blah, blah, blah. A couple of conditions though. The mechanic, the linchpin mechanic, whatever it is that you decide on, needs to be discoverable and obvious. It needs to not be too buried, too arcane, too weird to guess. The last thing you want is to turn this into like a clever contest of, you didn't guess the magic thing that I have in my head that I'm not telling you type of riddle that's really frustrating and annoying. Ideally, again, echoing something I said in the last video, what they need to do should be obvious but hard, right? Obvious but difficult. That's the sweet spot. You can make it a little bit less obvious. The better that your players know you and the more that you have played together, the more you can start playing with that balance a little bit, because they know your encounter design and they're going to start to kind of guess. And it's going to feel a little bit obvious if you just do the same thing again and again. And in my experience, this sort of thing isn't a lot of fun unless there's some kind of pressure or urgency being applied to the PCs. If they have just as much time as they need, then it's kind of like, it's just annoying, right? It's like trying to find something that you've lost in a messy room. It's not a fun mechanic. If there's pressure, preferably a very visible ticking clock that you can see, then that makes things much more entertaining and raises the stakes a lot more, right? So that's something that I'd say you need to probably put into an encounter like this. And finally, if the linchpin is very difficult or the PCs have been through a lot to try to discover this flaw, then it can be super fun if exploiting this mechanic radically swings the balance of the encounter in their favor. If you just bring the odds back up to even, regular D&D game balance, which is slightly in favor of the PCs, then that feels pretty grindy, right? Like they've been through all of this other stuff and finally discovered that, that thing, we have to move the runes in this order, blah, blah, whatever it is. And then they just get back to normal combat after that. It feels a little bit underwhelming, right? Like you want to highlight the payoff. Not just the dopamine hit of going, I figured out the puzzle and it gives us XYZ benefits, right? This can be something as simple as a damage buff. It can be that they get healed, whatever it is. Like there's a load of different ways that you can think about. That's something we can talk about more. I've got another video coming up about buffs and debuffs, another mechanic you can use and works really nicely hand in hand with this one. But just imagine like the PCs get a massive damage buff for triggering the linchpin. Suddenly they can turn around to all those enemies that they were worried about before and obliterate a ton of them, and it feels great. I created a quick example so we can look here. Shout out to Seppuku. This is the amazing map maker. I love their maps so much. I just thought, I'd highlight this because look at the gorgeous, look how amazing this map art is. I've only used like a tiny bit of it for this example, but go and check them out. I'll put a link in the description. Everything they do is just incredible. And I hope it's okay for me to use this, but it says on their subreddit that they're keen for people to use their material and to post up the way that they used it. So I hope this counts. I'm not claiming credit for this map at all. I could never draw anything this beautiful, but yeah, it works really nicely because of just the structure of the way that the map looks. Let's imagine the PCs have been teleported into this horrible situation. They're in the middle of the screen here, and they need to destroy this Ashen Rift Lord who's up here doing something nefarious. We don't know. I just picked the first map that I found on their subreddit, by the way, and I built this thing out of it. So I don't have any greater details here, but it should illustrate the principle. Right, they need to destroy this Ashen Rift Lord. And here's all the Ashen Rift Lord's servants. We've got a bunch of burnt ones, which look like just standard rank and file foot soldiers. We have Abyssal Hellblades, which are like big, terrifying demons in black iron armor wielding molten greatswords. And we have 2 Pyre Lords, which look like sort of like flaming elemental spellcasters. And each one of them is standing next to a pillar of molten crystal, which is pulsing with energy and drawing fire up from the magma fields below and feeding it into the aura of the Rift Lord. You can see this energy, this flame is just like bathing the Rift Lord, and the Rift Lord is standing there in a shield, a towering shield of flames. This is off the top of my head. Obviously, if this was for real, I'd write a better description. But you can see that probably the 2 pillars of crystal are important, right? The Rift Lord is shielded. If you're a PC who's been through any number of combat encounters, you're like, right, we're not killing that thing because it's covered in fire and we need to get rid of the fire before we can attack it. That's really signaling it. I'm making it very obvious here, but again, that's good because what they need to do is obvious but difficult. So they need to plow through all these minions. Maybe the Pyre Lords are like chanting, sustaining an incantation that is allowing the energy thing to happen, and just killing them will be enough to remove the shield. Or maybe the pillars themselves need to be destroyed. The PCs have a bunch of choices that they need to make here. Probably what's going to be best is if they stick together and move up one arm here, fight this one first, battle their way over here, fight this one next. Maybe the pillars also grant a benefit to the foot soldiers and the Abyssal Hellblades so that when they destroy one of them, the enemies become more vulnerable to damage, or maybe destroying a crystal pillar stuns all enemies within 5 squares for a round or something like that. One neat thing to do here, you thought this wasn't bad enough and it's okay, great, we've got to destroy these 2 things before we can start fighting the actual real boss, and God knows what this thing will do. But then, at the end of the Rift Lord's first turn, let's just do this, right? It grows. It gets more powerful. It's getting bigger. And this is a very visceral way to convey to the PCs that this is the situation they need to get handled soon. Otherwise, this thing is going to get out of control. And maybe mechanically, each time it grows, it gains 10 temporary hit points and a stacking +1 bonus to attack rolls and damage. So that if they take 5 or 6 rounds to get to this thing, it's got 50 or 60 extra hit points, and it's at a +5 to hit and a +5 to damage. That's pretty significant, right? So there's your incentive, there's your ticking clock and your pressure. This is a pretty straightforward example of a linchpin mechanic. The linchpin here are the 2 crystal pillars. They need to be destroyed. And you could say that when the PCs get close to them, they can use whatever skills they can justify. Maybe it's an Arcana check to shatter the crystal. Maybe it's athletics to push the thing over. I tend to not prescribe you have to use this skill to solve this thing. I'd prefer that people think creatively and go I'm going to use this skill in this entertaining way. That's way better. Maybe the crystal pillars regenerate. So while they're in the middle of fighting the giant demon up the top, the crystal pillars regenerate and the flame shield comes back, and they have to then split their attention between destroying the crystals and coming back to finish off the boss. And effectively here also you've got an encounter with 2 phases immediately out of the box, because phase 1 is this stuff, the pillars and all the enemies. Phase 2 is the big boss that's growing and growing. And the quicker you finish phase 1, the easier phase 2 will be. So they're linked mechanically, which is really good. And then you can have a callback to have these 2 pillars come back into the mix during phase 2 and be relevant again. So you can see that out of just this idea of having a fundamental flaw or weakness or something that isn't just killing all the monsters, quite a lot of emergent gameplay and quite a lot of interesting stuff pops out. I'll give another example and caveat that this is probably the most complicated combat encounter that I have ever designed. I don't blame if you want to bail out of the video here, but if you want to see the true degeneracy that I'm capable of, then stick around. Okay, so this was part of the capstone combat encounter of the campaign. I guess it was very, very significant combat encounter. This is part 2 of 3 combat encounters that run back to back. So this is extremely difficult. Mind you, the PCs are Paragon, well into Paragon by this stage. I think they're level 14 here, which is quite powerful. And they did pull it off. To set the scene, the PCs were warring against the Drow. The Drow were like this hidden menace the whole way through. And the Drow, thousands of years ago, they made an agreement with demons, spawned a demonic army, and basically tried to conquer the entire world, and were turned back at the last second by an alliance of the mortal races, which were propped up by the gods of good, who gave them dragons as weapons to fight against the demons. And this is the reason that dragons exist in the world, but only good dragons, only metallic dragons exist because they're the only ones that were created. The Drow lost, were driven underground, were persecuted with crusades, and the Drow ended up in the Underdark as a result. So they've been plotting how to restore themselves to power, how to win what they lost. Lolth was very angry with her people for their loss. She's obviously not a compassionate deity. She abandoned them when they failed her, and they are trying to win her favor back. The PCs find the inner sanctum of the Drow people called Spiderheart Sanctum, and in that they find this terrible ritual that is being conducted by the high priestess of Lolth. There's the corpses of 5 ancient metallic dragons in a pit, and the Drow are planning to raise them using sorcery to create a pet for Lolth, a living weapon. Turns out that this is basically Tiamat, right? They create Tiamat, they create a god unknowingly, and the PCs get involved and they interfere with the ritual, and what should be just a dumb, unthinking dragon weapon creature gains sentience and breaks the chains of its servitude and turns on its creators and does all this kind of stuff. So that's basically what's going on here. The PCs are trying to stop the Drow with what they're doing and survive, while this gigantic monstrosity is kind of like rising up out of the pit. It's a nascent god. It's blind. It doesn't know what's going on. It's kind of like just attacking stuff at random, breathing in random directions, huge gouts of fire and acid and whatever. So that's the scene. When the PCs come into this combat encounter, they've escaped the previous combat encounter. They started inside a cage. They were going to be sacrificed to this beast, and they broke out of the cage and they fought their captors and got their gear back and all the rest of it. And they're making their way around the pit to the ziggurat where the priestess is to kill her. And this chapel, this unholy chapel of Lolth, is in their way. Mechanically, there's quite a lot going on here. The TLDR is that there are 2 different linchpins both interacting inside of this encounter that both need to be handled in order for the PCs to win. The Drow soldiers are concerned with Tiamat, so they're not going to mess with the PCs. The PCs can kind of sneak up here or jump up onto the dais this way. The big red triangle is on the GM layer. The PCs can't see it, but basically that's Tiamat's breath weapon. I didn't want a close burst 5 or whatever. I wanted a close burst fuck you. That's what that breath weapon is. So the PCs typically they'll get like a round of warning to move. I push the triangles up onto the map layer so the PCs can see, and I described him at breathing in, like, Onyxia takes a deep breath, same kind of thing. You got to signal these things, otherwise it's not very fun. But yeah, then the PCs are like, oh my God, we have to get out of this, the zone. There's actually a story I'll tell you about what my wizard player did in this. It was the coolest thing. But yeah, basically like that breath weapon is going to obliterate all of those Drow soldiers. Everything in that field is just going to get destroyed. There's that, but the breath weapon is random. Like, it can be one of 8 directions, and Tiamat's breathing all over the place, each round. So it may or may not happen here, but if it does, that's one more thing they're going to have to deal with. If they're in this part of the map, then it's going to serve as a subtle way to kind of like push the PCs toward the action, which is up here, the priestess and the Blades of Lolth and the statue. This is the stuff that is important for this encounter. I think there are 30 or 35 Drow Zealots on the map. They do nothing but sing. They sing a horrible death song of Lolth. It's a shrieking, wailing supplication to the Spider Queen. Each Zealot singing inflicts a stacking -1 penalty to damage on the PCs. So they have a -35 penalty to damage that becomes -34 if they can kill 1 Zealot, -33 if they can kill 2 Zealots. Even at level 14, you could probably blow like a significant power or 2 and breach that, do more than that damage. but they're just minions. So like blowing your big hits, not the most efficient way through the encounter. The Drow Zealots also have an aura. I don't have it showing for some reason, but they also have an aura, which means that if the PCs walk through that, they don't get opportunity attacks or any of the rest of that stuff because it would just be too painful with this number of enemies on the board to be like, okay, roll that OA and then move 2 steps and then roll another OA and, you know, all the rest of it. So to cut down the fluff and make things quicker, they have an aura. If you move through the aura, then they drain some hit points from you and they gain temporary hit points, which makes it even worse, right? Because then now these minions that are inflicting a damage penalty also have more than 1 hit point and are harder to kill. The Blades of Lolth are an elite assassin cabal that exist inside of my world. There are 8 of them, 1 for each leg of the spider. And this is the 3rd and 4th Blades of Lolth that they have to fight here. Very mobile. They do a lot of damage. They're very dangerous. And they have an ability which they share, which is, it's 2 shields. One is the Aegis of Lolth and one is the Mantle of Lolth. The Aegis of Lolth makes you immune to weapon attacks, weapon keyworded attacks. The Mantle of Lolth makes you immune to implement keyworded attacks. So basically one is immune to physical damage, one is immune to spells. This is a tried and true trope. You know, the double boss, one with different immunities. But the trick is that they can swap that immunity as a free action anytime they want, while they are affected by the statue's aura. So this is a really horrible mechanic. And like, this is me just like tightening the screws as hard as I possibly could. So, you know, don't think I'm too much of a sadist. I'm going to explain the way that this thing unravels. But basically that means that if you run up to the one that is immune to implement attacks and you try to hit it with a weapon, then it can just swap its immunity with the other one and become immune to weapon attacks and your attack does nothing. Right, so it's really, really awful, really like robs the PCs of any feeling of power. Not only do they have this horrible damage penalty, but they can't even hit these things at all. They can't do anything. It is made that much worse by the personality. Obviously, the Drow are very haughty, constantly taunting the PCs, constantly telling them how weak and pitiful they are. Like all this sort of stuff makes it even worse when that's reflected with the mechanics. It feels totally unfair, really. The statue has an aura map, like a gigantic aura, basically. The first effect is that it lets the Blades of Lolth swap their immunity around, but the second effect is that it reduces all healing by 50%. So, right? Like, this is just getting worse and worse and worse. This is horrible, right? Here's the Statue of Lolth sitting there. So then there's the Priestess of Lolth. Doesn't have much abilities on her own, but she leads the Drow Zealots in their song. She leads the Death Song of Lolth, and she sustains that each round. When the Priestess of Lolth is bloodied, she will sacrifice all of the Drow Zealots on the field and empower the statue. And at that point, the statue's aura causes all healing to be negated completely. There is no healing inside the aura while the Priestess is bloodied, as long as she can continue the chant. The Drow Zealots are all dead. The damage penalty, therefore, is gone. But at that point in time, that basically becomes a race against the clock, a damage race, because your damage penalty is gone, but you can't heal at all. So there's the whole house of cards. It's pretty horrible. And let's just think about this from the player character's point of view. All of these mechanics basically remove ways that the PCs feel powerful. Right? Ways that the players get to feel powerful through their PCs directly are attacked by these mechanics. They can't heal, so they can't take damage. They can't recover from damage. They can't move across the map because they're going to take a bunch of damage and strengthen their enemies. They can't do any damage because of this massive damage penalty because of the Zealots singing. And the whole time they're getting harassed and attacked by the Blades of Lolth, who represent their arch nemesis. So this is really horrible as the PCs. Like, and I remember when I ran it, one of the Blades of Lolth swapped her immunity right as someone went to attack her, and the attack bounced off and did nothing. And the PC that attacked her actually threw their hands up and said, "Oh, okay, I hate this." And before you think that I'm just some kind of sicko that gets off on making people feel bad, it's not about that. What's happening is the winding up of tension, right? It's that this thing is getting like, it's more and more and more and more and more oppressive. And when the magic thing that is discovered that causes, the first domino to fall and the house of cards to start to tumble, then that tension will be released. It will explode. And the PCs, it'll be like a moment of, oh, now I gotcha, right? Like that kind of feeling. And that doesn't come without significant pressure the other way first. So yeah, this is all pretty awful and very complicated. Right? Very complex. Again, I can't stress enough, don't throw new players into this sort of thing. Don't throw players that you're not familiar with into this sort of thing. The group I had been running with, we had been running together for 3 years at this point, and they knew my shenanigans and they knew the kind of things that I was prone to design. And even then, it took them a little bit to work this out, because this is what I mentioned at the start, where you start to like hide things a little bit more, but it's all hidden in plain sight. And I made sure to really over narrate the statue, the looming presence, the blue fires next to it, the way that it kind of like seemed to oppress the battlefield with its aura, all this sort of stuff. So the statue is a big deal. It's just that there's so much going on. And also the statue and the priestess are in like the most inconvenient place possible, because they're way on the other side of the battlefield, on the other side of all the movement obstacles that you can't get through, and they're being protected by these two blades of Lolth, which are really dangerous. So there's an awful lot of stuff that's going to kind of distract you. But if you think about it, if you can get to the statue and destroy it, then your healing penalty is gone, and the blades of Lolth can't swap their immunity anymore. So that's a massive linchpin right there. Like, it's super important. And in the end, it took them a while to ask about the statue. But the second that they start asking about the statue, can I use an acrobatics check to climb up on top of it and pry a gem out of its eye socket? Yeah, sure. Can I use an athletics check to try and push it over? Yes, sure. You want to feed this, right? You want to help them. As soon as they start pulling that thread, you throw fire on it, right? Immediately. You're like, yes, go. Kill the statue. Because as soon as they kill the statue, then a large part of the frustration and the limitations get removed. And then the other thing is the damage penalty. Well, the Priestess of Lolth is vulnerable. She can't take damage because of the way that the Zealots are singing, but she's still vulnerable to status effects. So she could be stunned, she could be dazed, she could be anything that would prevent her from leading the song will give you a moment where the damage penalty goes away. And that creates like a moment of hope where someone maybe like, I don't know, could use Boots of Leaping, leap next to her, hit her with Anvil of Doom. She's not going to take any damage, but she will be stunned. And then she's stunned for a round, and then basically the PC will turn around and go, you have 1 round to murder as many Drow Zealots as you possibly can. And then it's open season for the bursts and the blasts, bring the wizard, bring the invoker, whatever it is, like try to just annihilate this damage penalty as much as you can. Blow everything you got. This is your big chance. Go. Right? And that's very dramatic, very fun. I built a few ways in here that would give the PCs a little bit of a, like, chip away a little bit at the armor of what's going on. There's also the possibility that Tiamat will obliterate a bunch of them here and give the PCs actually help them unwittingly. The Priestess of Lolth also has an interrupt ability. I hate counterspell as a mechanic. I think it's kind of just really annoying. But I tried to engineer this in a way that wouldn't be. So basically, on her or one of her allies being attacked, she will interrupt the attack and negate it. But then there's a moment where her mind is open and the person who used the attack can choose to enter a psychic duel with her. And the way that the duel works is that on either the PC or the priestess's next turn, they have to make opposed arcana or, I think it was arcana or religion checks, something like that. And whoever gets the highest wins. And if the priestess wins, the PC is dominated. Right? So they could go really, really badly. But if the PC wins, the priestess is stunned for a round, which means that she can't sustain the Song of Lolth, which means that the damage penalty goes away. So that psychic duel was like a little foolproof way in case the PCs didn't use some other ability to take her out. It was just a way of giving them an in, even though it doesn't look like it because it looks like she just negated your ability. I remember, the wizard was the one who had his ability negated, and he's like, oh, hell yes, I'll enter a psychic duel with her. And he absolutely wiped the floor with her, stunned her for a round. Do you see? Like, as soon as that thing happens, if you create this big house of cards that's got all these reliant conditions, as soon as you kind of like affect one of them, the whole thing starts to come apart and tumble down. Because at that point, the PCs went bananas, killed a bunch of the Zealots, and then they destroyed the statue, and that removed the healing penalty, and then they kind of just mopped up the encounter. So there's a few different parts here. If you focus on the statue first, it means that you're going to remove the healing penalty, and you're going to remove Shanash and Litha's ability to switch their immunity. And if you focus on the priestess first, then you're going to get rid of your damage penalty. But you kind of have to do both. These two linchpins depend on each other and both need to be satisfied in order for you to win this encounter. So yeah, one of the more complex implementations that I've ever put into a D&D encounter, but it shows you the kind of stuff that you can do with linchpins. I think they're really, really fun. I heartily encourage you to use them. I've had a lot of mileage from them, and they mesh really well with other mechanics. Like, I don't know, a crystal that needs to be destroyed so that infinite waves of demons stop spawning. And there you have a wave mechanic and a linchpin working together. Like I said, you can have a linchpin mechanic and skill challenges working together. They just kind of really hold an account, no pun intended, right? But they hold an encounter together really nicely. So yeah, that's just a couple of thoughts about linchpins. Yeah, more mechanics videos coming up. Catch you then. Thanks very much for watching. Bye. I realized I forgot to tell the story about the wizard and Tiamat's breath weapon. So at the time that the PCs actually got caught by the breath weapon, it wasn't in this combat encounter, it was the next one. Tiamat breathed in and everyone ran, but there was a reason, I can't quite remember why, but there was something that had to be done on the map, and the wizard stayed behind inside the area of the breath weapon to finish it off, and everyone was like, oh my god, he's gonna die, because they'd just seen this breath weapon like obliterate entire battalions of drow soldiers or whatever. Like, so the wizard's like calmly standing there as this enormous dragon god like breathes in, and like a gout of fire and acid and lightning comes roaring towards him, and he uses warp in the weave. For anyone who doesn't know, Warp in the Weave is an immediate interrupt which is triggered when a creature uses a burst or blast power that includes you. You spend a healing surge, regain no hit points, and the triggering burst or blast does not target you or your square. Basically, it's just a nope for burst and blast, which is exactly what this was. It couldn't have been a more perfect thing for him to use at that point. And I was like, that is the most amazing thing, just this visual of this powerful wizard like just shimmering out of existence. You get to just sit there and like let this god breathe its breath weapon all over you and be completely untouched. Yeah, afterwards. It was one of the coolest moments that I can remember from that campaign. Very, very cool. So props to you, Mariusko, if you're watching this video. That was an awesome moment that I'll always remember.